Thank you so much for that introduction, David. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all the speakers today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've had the whole day to get nervous, but hopefully it won't last long. Never had cramp in my foot before at all, though that's a new one. I'm particularly happy to see Sean here. Right, just a few things to tell you as kind of background before I launch into the sort of the talk itself. I can get quite lost in the subject, and there's different stories here. There's the story itself of me growing up in the countercultural environment that I did, and then there's the story of the book and how that came together, and then there's the story of all the different characters who kind of appear within this book. So just a little bit of context before we start that might help make sense of it if I wander off too much. So this project was initially funded as a period of research and development through the Arts Council. So I was really lucky to have a kind of initial year to sort of get this work off the ground and start thinking about what it actually was, because of course back then it wasn't any of the things it is now. And then following on from that, I was very lucky to get some more funding to continue with that. So it's got these two phases. And I was also very lucky to collaborate with Val Williams, who runs the photography in the Archive Research Centre, and Malcolm Dixon from Street Level Photoworks, who are both really great people to work with, so they helped a lot. You're also going to see a mixture of material, which I'll try to explain and not be too confusing about. But the black and white images you'll see are Dave Walkling's archival photographs that he took in the 70s, and the colour photographs are my images, which are more a kind of mediation on the past, a kind of looking back. So that's just to kind of tell you what you're looking at. There's also bits of creative writing and text and things like that. It's a slightly strange place to start, but I just want to read a tiny little snippet of a recent book review, which filled me with such pleasure, really, just because it was that thing of, when you make a book, is anyone going to get the story? I've tried to pack so much into this narrative. Will anyone get it? Will it make sense? And for me, it was taking huge risks a lot of the time with not, and I think Ron talked about this a lot, with not leading the viewer too much, with not leading the reader too much, but allowing them to make the discoveries and allowing them to go on that journey, really, through the book. So this is written by Mick Gidley, and it's in this source. He said, "Growing up is a miscellany of autobiography, history, social documentary, exhibition, catalogue, poetry, and more that transcends any particular genre, but while deliberately non-homogeneous and collective, featuring, for instance, work by 3 members of the Ryley family, some of it by Marjolaine and her mother Brigitte composed in tandem. This is the result of a coherent project and constitutes an ordered composition. As in a cliche, it's more than the sum of its parts." I mean, I was just so thrilled with that, because that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to bring together this miscellany of material and try to make sense of it, but not to tell you what to think, to allow you to sort of explore that and go on a journey. He also points out that it covers nearly 50 years, which is something that I hadn't even really occurred to me. I hadn't even really got my head around that. So I thought, isn't it funny how other people can sometimes say it so much better than you can? So this is the talk I'm going to do today, which is, I've called it A Journey into Wonderland. The book itself, I'm going to kind of dip in and out of page spreads and sort of individual images, just to sort of hopefully give you as much of a kind of sense of the work as I can. Get a good idea of it there. Let's go back to this one quickly. So, really, Growing Up in the New Age is the title of what I sort of think of as a multidisciplinary artwork, which crosses over between the kind of the book form, but also it's been shown in an exhibition format. This is a shot from Wolverhampton Art Gallery, where it was exhibited. Interestingly enough, before the book came out, so I sort of had the opposite problem, which was translating quite a major exhibition of the work into a book form. I'll talk a bit more about that. And the ways in which I was able to try to kind of make parallels between the two and use them in kind of helpful ways. And also use some of the imagery the exhibition shots within the book. I found a way to do that. I was quite concerned that I didn't want it to be too exhibition catalogue-y, but that would add something rather than kind of subtract. It's also a website. I started off, when I did the first research phase, I created a website which is immediately out of date the second you do it. The lovely thing about a book is no one expects it to change, but obviously a website, you have to keep updating it, and you know, it's a hassle, isn't it? But it's lovely with a book. You think, well, that's that now, that's done and dusted, and I don't have to think about it anymore. But I wanted to share the journey of making the work with the kind of audience, and so I set up this, including things I was reading, books that I was interested in. So it's not a perfect forum, but it was a good sort of way of creating some kind of dialogue really around the project as I was kind of going along. So the book is really about trying to tell the story of a kind of experience of my kind of childhood, but looking to put that in a wider kind of cultural perspective really. So it's a journey through my parents' history, but also a re-looking at my childhood, because I experienced it very much as a child rather than as an adult, and so it was quite a different. I mean, we all think we know about the 60s and the 70s and the counterculture and the hippies and all of that, don't you think you know about it? But when you really start to look at it, what was it like, what happened, what was it like to live through that? I found that I learned a huge amount about what that experience was really like on the journey. So I was born in a communal squat in 1974. This is the communal squat in South London. This was actually the image we used in the book. We went for a colour one in the end. That's actually one of Dave Walkling's images. I came across Dave Walkling's work while I was doing the research part of the project. I was looking for somebody who, because of course I didn't have any photographs from the initial period of the 70s. I came across his work, fantastic kind of archive of both black and white and colour images. It turned out he knew my parents. He'd photographed the sort of South London squatting scene quite extensively. There was actually a dark room in the basement of this squat, 81 Picket Road, where I was born, and he was actually working in the basement in the dark room around the time when I would have been born there, which is really quite strange. So this is one of the images we used in the book. That's actually one of his images. That's 81 Thicket Road. It's actually on the edge of the Crystal Palace Park in South London. I'm going to talk a bit more about the squatting element of it later, so I'll kind of come back to that. Oh, strange, it's a different colour. That's all right. So just bear with me. It's quite important to give you a bit of kind of background to this. So what I really wanted to talk about, I guess, was for me, it can be difficult to define the kind of exact moment when a creative idea takes root. I like to think of the analogy of a kind of sponge that you gradually fill with water until you get to a point where you can kind of squeeze it and all these drops come out. And that's the point at which you sort of start to know what the work will be. But for me, there are two moments that kind of represent that kind of porousness, if you like. The first moment was... I need to kind of jump back a little bit here. In 2003, I was teaching full-time. I just moved up to the north of England for a teaching post. I was working full-time, I just bought a house, had a kind of hefty mortgage, and I was starting to feel a bit like life was a kind of fait accompli, if you like. And I was kind of, without realising it too much, I was sort of gradually becoming quite unhappy. And I was given this reprieve in the form of acceptance onto an artist workshop. It was 2 weeks. At a place called Braziers Park. Braziers is actually a real commune, and you could go and stay there. 25 artists, sort of UK and internationally, would go to Braziers and actually stay there. And I had written in my proposal that I wanted to look at, because Braziers is a real commune, as I think I said, and I wanted to use that experience to start thinking a little bit about my history and the kind of past. But it was a very strange experience when I got there, because you've got the commune and the house, which is where the kind of the people who live there sort of live, but the artists are off in this kind of field. It was a bit like art camp, so we had like these sort of tents, and then we had our own little caravan kitchen area, and then someone had built a dance floor, and so we sort of would go off for 2 weeks during the day and make work, and then at night we'd kind of have these sort of just crazy nights of dancing and drinking and staying up all night. It was sort of like being regressing almost. And I think Braziers really worked its magic on me, kind of the way that some camps of my childhood had. One day I went out alone into the fields, and I was lying kind of on my tummy with my camera in front of me, and this is the picture that I took. And I was lying on my tummy and I could hear the wasps, and I could hear all the sounds of nature, and could hear this buzzing, and could sort of feel myself on the earth. I didn't really know why I was taking this picture. I was just kind of flopped there. But I had this kind of, this realisation really. And I wrote it down quite soon after this. And I've been, over the years, sort of dipping in and out of creative writing, and it's something that's become much more kind of part of my practice. And I still find it quite difficult because they feel so personal, but somehow they've become so important that I have to sort of get over the embarrassment and just let them be part of the work. So this is included, that's actually one of the sort of spreads in the book where the Shooting Stars piece is included. But I'm just going to read it quickly because it sort of sets the tone for I'm going to read it from here, text quickly. You lay belly down, the sun feeling its way between the stems of long grass, wasps buzzing dangerously nearby, camera before you. You felt yourself remember in some deep recess of your soul. Yes, that was the word that came to mind. Your soul was being revived, stirred, called. A wise man, shaved head, Doc Marten boots, beautiful eyes, once told you as you picked nervously at the frayed edge of the armchair, how people spend a lifetime without realising that we all have multiple personalities. Embracing the different parts of you is the hardest thing. So how could that spirited, anarchistic child, full of self-assurance, joy, energy, and a dictionary of swear words no child should know, have turned into a conformist member of society with a 9-to-5 job and a mortgage? You were living the wrong life. There it was, as clear as the shooting stars that you had watched the night before as you lay on the grass, staring up at the clear skies with 2 other momentary kindred spirits. And just as the gypsy fortune teller that you had dressed as on the theme night of Come as Your Alternative Profession seemed eerily to have the gift of sight as she read people's cards, so you now had the gift of insight, the gift that so many had sought through these very same means. So that was kind of a bit of a moment really, and I'm making it sound dramatic, but it kind of was dramatic. I was a bit like, oh my God, I've got to do something about my life. It's not good at the minute, you know. It was kind of, it was important, and I made that image. And actually some of the images I then made at Brazier's, without knowing it at the time, but they started to go into my kind of archive that later I was able to draw from. I tend to work on projects over a long period of time, it can even be sort of 5-10 years now. And I had a moment one day when I realised it's all my work, I can do whatever I want with it. If I want to take an image from 10 years ago and put it in this series, and it's all me, it's all the themes that I'm interested in, it's all I don't have to, I think, Jess was saying, you know, it doesn't have to be like little projects all the time, you know, that kind of, so I was able to, I started taking some images at Braze, and I still didn't conceive of this work quite in this way at the time, but the roots were kind of sown. This is the hall at Braze's where we used to eat. The thing that was quite interesting for me at Braze's was when we initially arrived, people were quite uncomfortable with the communal eating. Everyone used to eat together in the main hall, and we all had to take turns with washing up. I could see that people were always sort of grumbling about the fact that, you know, they hadn't had enough to eat, or they'd had to do this, or they'd have to do that. And then slowly people sort of settled into this routine of just kind of going with the flow, really. But this was one of the only children that was part of the commune, and I just really loved this image of Zach just kind of in this amazing space, but kind of also quite isolated, because it reminded me a little bit of, although there were lots of children around in my childhood, I was an only child, so I could kind of relate to that. And so children started to kind of feature in the work. So Braze's kind of worked its magic on me, I guess, is the way to describe it. Over the following days, I'm just going to go through a few of the images as I sort of talk. Memories from my childhood kept sort of pushing into the surface of my consciousness. The environment at Braze's reminded me so much of aspects of my childhood, periods I'd spent in the south of France, Victorian houses and rambling gardens of the South London squats, summer and Easter camps, festivals. It was visceral, tactile even, shades of green, sunlight, water, rambling gardens, mud, woven rugs, vegetables, flowing skirts and charcoal blackened pots, all kind of writ within my own eyelids. And it was a bit like that feeling of something that won't go away, and I kind of knew that there was a project there, as well as a kind of an urgent need to make some changes. Within the book, I played around with lots of different ways of exploring and telling the story, and I'll come to that a little bit more. Some are individual images, some are pairs. This is one of the pairings. Some contain text pieces and image pieces. I worked with a fantastic designer called Dean Pavitt, who I can't praise enough, who kind of really saved me and was my kind of, I would say we did it together. You know, I gave him a book dummy, but without him I really would have been lost. So the second, talking about this porousness of when ideas take root, the second kind of porous moment for me was the discovery of a letter. It was one of the most profound experiences, again, of my life. And just to sort of give you a little bit of background to it, my mother is from Belgium, so all my relatives on my mother's side of the family are from Belgium. My father's English. My grandmother's lived in Brussels for many years, and I've made work about that in Résidence Astrale and also the Seaside House, Villamona, that we mentioned before. There was a fire in her apartment in 2005. Well, it was actually a fire in the basement, but the smoke and the soot went up through the building. And she was actually very ill. She was suffering from smoke inhalation. She was taken to a military hospital in Brussels. And my mother and I had the job of having to go and actually sort out all her stuff, which was covered in all this soot. And I used some objects in this letter, sort of much later down the line when she was recovered, and I sort of felt like it was time to revisit it as part of the work. But the letter that we discovered, as well as, quite interestingly, this photograph of my family that she had kept, and a little bit of herself that she chopped off the end. I thought that was really odd that she'd created this kind of family unit, even though my parents actually divorced when I was about 2. They lived in communal houses for a long time, but they were actually separated. She'd actually kept us as a family, but she'd sliced herself off the end. A very interesting act of editing there. But what we found was a letter which was sent in 1974, so I would have been 6 months old, from my father's parents living in the Wirral, Merseyside, to my mother's parents in Dilbeek, Belgium. And I'll just read you a little extract of it. It starts off, "Dear Mrs. Tearlock, we were so happy to receive your friendly letter. We're so sorry to hear you've had sciatica," you know, the kind of niceties. And it's this bit, really, that was like a kind of voice from the grave, really. "Like yourselves, we are sorry that Peter and Brigitte have chosen to drop out of society. I respect their views, but believe that society is best helped and improved from within. We must, however, be grateful that they have not turned to drugs, dishonesty or violence. We shall all have fewer material belongings in the future, so perhaps they're preparing themselves for the world of the future." How wrong he was about the material belongings, eh? But I think for us, what was so interesting about it was just this idea that these figures of kind of, I guess, bourgeois authority had been kind of bourgeois authority to my parents, suddenly seemed much more human, and it was this kind of idea of, you know, their children off with a 6-month-old baby, God knows where, doing God knows what, and that they were having this conversation about it. And again, I thought to myself, well, what was that really about? What does that mean, they dropped out of society? And I wanted to explore that further. So this is the first, actually the first part of the book, the first page, the first side of the letter, and then you turn the page, and the other half of the letters, and that's before you read anything else in the book. And it just is, I guess, an invitation to the viewer to come on that journey, to the reader. So I'd say viewer or reader. You're the viewers, but obviously it's the book you're reading it, to go on that journey. The book itself, dark this screen, isn't it? The book itself, gosh, how do you organise a book with sort of, when you want to include so much? I knew I wanted to include some contextualising essays. Again, not essays about the work, but essays that would inform the viewer about the counterculture and kind of give it a broader historical context. I knew I wanted to include my own images, Dave Walkling's images, and then also writing, which I'll come to in a minute. It's kind of a bit of a funny one, this, but I was very, very, very influenced by a book called The Prophet and the Fly by Francis Elise. I don't know if any of you know his work. He had a fantastic retrospective recently at Tate. And I've been a fan of his work for years. I bought the book in Zurich in about 2000 when I was doing my MA. And this book has just literally kind of nourished and sustained me for many years. And I was struggling with a way to kind of order the work. And then it suddenly hit me. I was going to, that his headings were actually perfect. Now this is where I go a little bit off the wall here, but I've always had this thing from my parents about kind of signs, you know, signs that mean something and signs that take you somewhere. And I'm very much a non-believer in that sense, but I can't sort of help ignoring them as well. I can't help responding to them. So, so I thought to myself, it's a sign I should do this. So I had a long chat with Carol, who teaches theory, about the ins and outs of, you know, copyright and all of that stuff. But in the end, I just used the headings, the 3 sections that he has in his book, and at the end I've credited it and given a quote and talked about how he was an inspiration. So I have borrowed Francis's. I hope he sees this one. I don't know if he'll mind or not, but there you go. So that's how it's structured in the book. In the talk, it's going to be slightly different. But I have this feeling, you know, a talk is very sort of linear, isn't it? And obviously with a book, I know that people flick, and I sometimes have this feeling people start at the back, they go to the middle, they go to the front. And so for me, it really works, the layout in the book. And Dean and I worked a lot on sort of exploring that. But in the end, it made sense to have a kind of prologue with the essays at the beginning, and images, the main images, even though some are scattered through the book, but the main body of the images in the middle. And then the kind of the cabinet, which was a bit like a cabinet of curiosities, which contained some quite weird and wonderful things. So this is a spread from with Val's essay, and we used some images from my exhibition. This is an installation shot of a display case where I used New Age items from my mother's home, which she kindly lent me and has been asking for back ever since. So really, this is the beginning of this journey, the letter, braziers, and I was starting to ask myself this question really: were my hippie, eccentric parents in fact spiritual and countercultural activists, part of an incredible moment in history? Were they in fact heroes of their epoch? Notice how to say that, that's right, epoch. This is another image of Dave Walkling's that we use quite early on in the book, that just again gives a kind of flavour of that sort of time. I can almost imagine them hanging out on the steps there in that image. So one of the things that was really important for me, and that has been really important in my practice, is to try to incorporate different voices, because I'm very aware that especially if you're working on issues of kind of family and self and belonging and place, it can seem very it can seem one-dimensional. So for me, it was kind of, how do I incorporate other voices? And I'm quite fortunate in one sense that my parents both write. My mother contributed a piece to the Villamona book. This was before she did her MA, and I think was quite surprised that I wanted to include that work, a poem she'd written. She later wrote another piece for that. And she went on to do an MA in creative writing, which was actually really helpful, because I kind of learned a huge amount through that process of sort of working with her on it, and it's also quite painful helping her with the dissertation, but worth it. And my father has kind of written on and off for years. He has an autobiography that he wrote, which is a proper full-length autobiography of his entire kind of life up to that point. And I thought a lot about whether I could use that and in what form. It's pretty off the wall, it's pretty out there, so I had to think quite hard about. One of the difficulties, I suppose, with kind of, this is how some of these were used in the book. That's me and my parents, in case you hadn't worked that out. Haven't you? One of the difficulties is in terms of how you construct meaning, if you start to use other people's images or texts, is the kind of, obviously, desire that you have to sort of make it fit what you're trying to say. And I had to really fight against that impulse and say to myself, right, some of this information, I just have to present it to the viewer and let them, to the reader, to let them make their own analysis. And if they think it's crackers, then that's up to them. And if they think it's deeply profound, you know, credit them with the intelligence to be able to assimilate that information, to be able to make their own judgments about that, really. Sort of coming back to the story, and then I'm going to just read a little bit of both my parents' writing. But in the end, what I did was I commissioned my mum to write a piece for Growing Up in the New Age. I didn't pay her a huge amount. I had the Arts Council money, and I said, "You're a writer, I'm going to commission you." Anyway, she wrote this 13,000 word piece, which I then had to edit. It nearly killed me. But I've distilled it down to this fantastic story about her whole, you know, it's called The Meandering River. And Val actually talks about it as being one of the very few records by a woman living through that time, detailed records. And I also, my father very kindly allowed me to reproduce the first chapter of his autobiography. But just to sort of come back to the story, really, why it was important to include those, I want to sort of give a little bit of background to sort of where we got to this point and sort of how it all happened. This is an image called the Arc. The title is the Arc. The Arc is actually a commune in the south of France, L'Arche, I should say, in French, where my parents met. And I wanted to trace the journey back to before I was even born. So it's been quite useful to be able to kind of use both their writing. And I also created a video, which was actually a response to this as well, but I've just reproduced the text of that and the images in the book. I won't read that now. So again, haven't said a lot about the colour images that I've made because I'm sort of jumping in and out, but I sort of hope you can work out from looking at them that you know, you would never be, I would never be describing them in the way I am now a little bit, but in the book they allow the viewer to enter a kind of alternative reality, if you like, or an alternative world, kind of mediated view of what that experience would have been like. But they're all inspired by or relate to memories, experiences, bits of text, snippets, bits of writing, things like that, things that really happened, things that didn't happen, if that makes sense. So I'm using them to kind of in relation to where they fit some of the text I'm reading. So I just want to read you a little snippet from my mum's piece that she wrote, which is included in the book, which I think is really interesting. She says, studying psychology in Europe in 1968 had been the beginning of a journey of emotional, intellectual and spiritual exploration. There was amongst a certain group, I'll just go back to that image of her, that's my mum there at university, it's a nice one to look at while I read this. There was amongst a certain group an atmosphere of questioning old grounds and a desire to create new forms of cultures. I was desperate to break away from restrictions and repressions brought about by closed communication systems encouraged by Catholicism and white middle-class dominated ideologies. I was very alienated from my parents and the rift seemed to get bigger as time went on. Louvain University could be likened to a big cauldron in which new intellectual, artistic and spiritual theories were brewing. They reached many areas of society, amongst them ideas around the nature of madness, named as anti-psychiatry. Ideas on organic farming and experimental ideas on education had reached us all the way from an alternative school, Summerhill, in England. Eastern philosophies and exotic esoteric texts by the likes of Carlos Castaneda were impregnating our brains. Vegetarian macrobiotic cafes, new age shops and esoteric bookshops were sprouting like mushrooms. Taking into account the cultural climate of the late 60s, it's no wonder that my official studies in psychology felt irrelevant compared to the new theories that seemed to point towards a counterculture. These years were filled with hope and possibilities. I often frequented alternative groups, and when given the opportunity to join a group of students to visit the community of L'Arche in France, I was delighted. So I really think that gives you a flavour of kind of where she was at that point. My father, was on his own spiritual journey at this point. He writes in his autobiography, "On a glorious May morning in the year of our Lord 1970, fate tapped me on a shoulder in a monastery. 2 years previously, the events of May 68 had rocked France like a hurricane whose turbulence was felt all over Europe and beyond. That same year was a revolutionary one in my own life. I'm gazing into the black water and the half-countrified park estate not far from my parents' home. I'm going to move on, I say to myself. All these years you've talked about living in the country, and you've only been there as a tourist. In January, I'm established as the sole resident of a seaside cottage on the Hebridean island of Jura. After Jura, he went to the Arc in France. So, again, it's not spelt out for you in the book, but all this information, that's just my water. All this information is there for you to kind of find, to kind of glean. That's a sign that I need to see. And I like the idea of you being able to discover that if you spend time with the book, that you don't know what you're going to find. And it's difficult with text, especially lengthy text, because there's no guarantee that anyone's going to read it. But on the other hand, I always think that you're really rewarded when you do go down that journey of starting to read things that are included. And I think that good photo books will have the text in there for a reason, And I also hate arbitrary text that tells you nothing or describes the work which you can see yourself perfectly well. But it can add something if it's done in an interesting way. In fact, Jem's Red River book was one of my favourite books of all time. I love the use of text within that. So, carry on with the story. How are we doing for time? Let's go quick. Okay, I'm all right. So my mum and dad met at the Arc, L'Arche, in France. My mother writes, "It was there sitting in a rustic kitchen peeling carrots that I met my husband-to-be. He had a long beard falling right down onto his chest and wore exotic Turkish baggy trousers. We started a conversation that continued through my week's visit, and to the shy student I was, he seemed full of wisdom. After discussion on education as practiced in Summerhill Alternative Free School, I remember thinking he'd be the ideal father to a child." My dad writes a little bit about the Arc as well. If I just... he talks about the founder, Lanzo del Vasto, who's one of Gandhi's first disciples in the West. He describes him as a tall, white-haired and bearded, fiercely blue-eyed patriarch, given more to poetry, theophilosophy and virile piety than to gentle warmth, humour or the common touch. But it's really interesting to me that this was the kind of starting point, and although they didn't stay at the Arc, in the end they found that it was quite restrictive, I think, compared to the kind of countercultural lifestyle that they wanted to have. It kind of set the scene, I guess, for places that they then went on to live, different communes in the South of France, different sort of experiences that they wanted to have. It was really interesting that around this time I was reading, while I was trying to make these decisions, I was reading a lot around the idea of utopia. And there's an extraordinary similarity between some of the descriptions from Thomas More's original Utopia and some of my father's descriptions of the Ark. So my dad writes about the Ark: "The bread was baked on the premises, carpentry and building being other crafts, whilst the women were active in sewing and weaving. All the companions had their own hand-woven cloaks, and many of the men had sleeveless jerkins and trousers. The women wore long skirts or dresses. They were undyed, the predominant colours being brown and cream." And then this is Thomas More talking about his communists. "It's a land of happy, healthy, public-spirited communists. Money and private property are extinct. Anyone can enter any house at any time. Doors are never locked. Everyone works at a trade, clothwork, masonry or carpentry, and takes a turn at agricultural labour in the countryside. Clothing is uniform and made of undyed homespun wool." I felt like they had almost stepped into or out of some kind of fictional novel. And I had never really talked to them about the Ark and what it was like, and so that was absolutely fascinating for me. So it felt as if growing up in the New Age was beginning to reveal its secrets. I had never sat down and read my father's autobiography. It was quite difficult to do for reasons I'll go into a bit later on. And I struggled and wrestled with the idea of how on earth can I distill something from this 3-volume, however many, 21 chapter books. In the end, we decided to reproduce just the whole of the first chapter and kind of leave it at that. It's not edited, it's not retyped, it's the original handwritten, hand-typed manuscript at the back, and we gave it the time, we gave it the pages, and it needed it. I also had to let my father write something to kind of contextualise it, which again was quite difficult to do. I was overcome with this urge to edit it, and I thought to myself, you know, he is who he is, and you have to let him be that and say what he wants to say, otherwise you are controlling that meaning again. You're controlling that meaning to a point where you're sort of... I might have taken out 1 or 2 lines, I've confessed, but mostly it's him, you know. You can't read it, but I have to get the book to read that bit. Anyway, so that's how it's produced in the book, very simply. We tried all sorts of things, scanning it, and it was a nightmare, but in the end we actually photographed it, which seemed to work the best. And it's lovely, actually, the texture of it, when you hold it, works really well. You suddenly feel like you're going into a kind of another alternative world bit. Okay, so this is a little bit of background to it. I think for me, one of the things about using my parents' writing was it allowed me to kind of experiment a little bit more with my own creative writing as well, and it made me a little bit more kind of confident about doing that. It's quite a difficult process, but I've tried to really, really work on that, and kind of there's been difficulties in terms of how to present the text, we used them in the exhibition, and then I actually got Dean to work on them for the exhibition. I'll just read you this one quickly. But this, I guess, is an example. In fact, hopefully, I'll go to the next one. Don't get the image. If I use this as an example of, I guess, a way that this story couldn't be told through a single photograph. This is, the image is an image I wanted to evoke of a moment in the south of France when I was there with my dad in Provence for a month. And the text, again, all the creative texts in the books kind of act as a counterpoint and sort of allow me to incorporate my own kind of memories. So this one's called The South of France. A whole month in the south of France, the long-haired man's house, the cat and the dog who must not meet. Roasted chops on the open fire every night with wine and conversation. Don't worry, he said, if you hear noises in the night, it's just me and Marie-Jeanne making love. The land stretched for miles, burnt ochre and yellow. You finally shed your pubescent modesty and join the nudists. Warm sun on your body, walking for miles through the orchards, picking fruit and flowers. A tiny tree with bright red berries, you ate them all. He was angry, they were ornamental. You let the dog in, he ate the cat's chops. Your confidence filled with the sights and smells of Provence. At night it was so bright in the glass room at the top of the house that you asked him to switch the light out. I can't switch off the stars and the moon, he told you. A place to dream of honey and nougat from the village on the hill where Marie-Jeanne lived. I still find it hard reading those out. It's like, I kind of think they sound pretentious, but then at the same time, I kind of know that there's bits that I had to pull, like little stories that I had to tell. And for better or worse, they're in there, and I guess you kind of either love them or hate them. But I was always very excited when they're described as poetry, like in that review, because they were never intended to be that, really. I see them more as just little portals, ways of describing experiences that I can't tell you any other way. Does that make sense? Like things that I want to share with you that kind of need to be shared, as it were. So, how are we doing here? All right. So, a lot of the images are images that are taken sort of during the phase of the project where I'm looking for specific things. Some are opportunistic. I mean, I've always struggled with this image of the girl with the painted face, because in a way it is obvious. But then I made a decision that, in a way, I wanted there to be some sort of slightly more obvious images that don't make you struggle to understand the meaning. And of course it is that thing of the flower child, but actually she's the daughter of one of the friends I grew up with. And that was at a Kirkdale School reunion, a free school I went to, which I haven't got to yet. And in the end, that image just kind of stuck. But it's, you know, images of children are difficult. And things like the teepee, again, was a specific experience about my father taking me to stay with the teepee people when I was a child, and how that was very odd, going from London and driving all night to this Welsh valley, and suddenly we were staying in these teepees with these people. So all the images, sort of, for me, have particular meaning. This one's about the south of France. My parents were fruit picking a lot when I was younger, and I remember summers spent just helping them put these apples in these crates. My mum talks about that quite a lot in her text. Images of nature seem to become quite important. And I wanted to kind of find a way in the book of incorporating some grids into the images. Well, I've used grids quite a lot in the exhibitions. But again, not grids that sort of jump out and sort of become too static, but kind of allow you to sort of go through them. Okay, so just a little bit more about the kind of squatting aspect of it. I think I said already that during this journey I came across the archive of photographer Dave Walkley. And Dave photographed, chronologically after the Ark, my parents came back to London for a while, and they lived at 81 Thicket Road, which was a communal squat. They then went back to France for a couple of years, and then when my mum was pregnant with me, they came back to England, and they moved back into 81 Thicket Road. And it was a legal squat that was run by a group of architectural students with the support of the local council. And we included some of Dave Walkling's images in the exhibition to sort of give a sense of how lovely his prints were, the original prints that he had in his drawer. And again, that idea about with a book, what you leave out, it was quite painful at times having to make those editing choices. I would have loved to use every image of his that I possibly could have done, but you have to make decisions, and sometimes that was one of the nice things about the exhibition, we could have a bit more material in there. But these are some of his images. And Dave talks a little bit about the commune. He says, we did a field study with Val Williams prior to doing the book, which is a mixture of his work and my work, which was quite a useful kind of starting point. And we did an interview for that. And he writes in that 81 Thicket Road was a genuine commune. It wasn't drug-orientated for a kick-off. It was alternative therapy and free school-orientated. That was the main thing coming out of that house. At one point, some of them were heavily into alternative therapies, which even included drinking your own urine. Mum and Dad have never owned up to doing that, but you never know. So again, the responsibility of kind of working with his archive's been something that's been both fantastic and rewarding, but also been quite difficult at times. And in the end, with the field study, Val had a very strong idea about the edit, and she used all his colour images. And when we came out of the meeting with her, he said, she's picked all my worst pictures. I was like, no, she hasn't, honestly. But I could totally see why she wanted the colour one, so it wasn't like then and after, then and now. But I pretty much, for the book, let him choose the ones he wanted, again, so that it was sort of, he felt ownership of that. And this is an image I've always particularly loved. And I wrote about this for, Val asked me to write about this for the one photograph piece in the Journal of Culture, and I called it Life on the Floor. And it just really reminded me of my parents. It's not my parents, it's Kevin and Anna, but that idea of sort of life on the floor, and how for a lot of people it represented, the lowest you could get. My grandmother was appalled, apparently, when she came to visit us in the squat, that my bed was a mattress on the floor. She thought that was like tantamount to sort of child abuse. Whereas they tried to explain that everyone lived on the floor and had mattresses and beanbags, and that was normal. But for me, I love this image of the sort of tea with the proper teacup, and I think it's an image that's very civilised and very beautiful, and it's almost like a kind of magic carpet that's about to take off. So it's been an absolute pleasure, but also challenging to use Dave's work. And these are all some of Dave's images. Also kind of just very strange moments, like that's actually me in that photograph with the bottle. And yeah, at a friend's birthday party, so I actually sort of appear in some of these images, which is pretty far out, and that's one of the squats that we lived in. My mum talks a lot about the squats in her essay, and the experience of living there as being very positive, but also being quite isolating. But I think for a woman with a small child, that was one of the things she found particularly helpful, that it can be very isolating having children, it can be very difficult as a mother, and she felt quite supported by the other mothers in the squats. I was reading a lot around sort of ideas of counterculture as well at this time. And one of the books that I've really found just fantastic, actually, is Counterculture Through the Ages, From Abraham to Acid House. Such a great title, isn't it? By Ken Goffman, and it's just all the countercultural peoples ever fit into one book, pretty much. And I started thinking about that, about what my parents were doing, and talking to my mum about it, talking to my dad about it, and I think my mum actually found it really helpful, because I think there were elements to her sort of dropping out that she found quite difficult to reconcile. Later on, when you drop out, it can be hard to step back in again to society, and that's something she struggled with. But seeing it against the backdrop of a sort of social and political and historical movement, I think, was actually really helpful for her as well. He talks about, Ken Goffman talks about counterculture. Nearly universal features of countercultures are breakthroughs and radical innovations in art, science, spirituality, philosophy and living, diversity, authentic, open communication and profound interpersonal contact, generosity and the democratic sharing of tools, persecution by mainstream culture of contemporaneous subcultures, exile or dropping out. He goes on to talk about the idea of counterculture as something that can't be crafted or produced, that it has to be lived. They weren't trying to be countercultural, they were just trying to live in a different way. And one of the things about the communes was they were trying to explore some kind of interpersonal contact that went beyond the kind of bourgeois nuclear family experiences that they'd grown up with. So these are Dave's images, which are kind of interspersed, but mostly in the back section, mixed in with my mother's essay, which in the end that worked really well. For my own images, again, sort of certain images, or certain ideas kept popping into my head. I had my daughter just before I got the first grant, and that I had all these ideas. I was going to go back to the south of France, and I was going to go to all these places, and A, I couldn't, and B, I suddenly thought, well, actually, there's no point going back there. It's not there anymore. Going back's not going to I can't go to those places and photograph them. So it became about a much more sort of metaphorical or dreamlike interpretation of it, and images of children sort of appeared in that. So some of them are taken when I was out with my daughter, trying to look for my own sort of versions of utopian places to take her, like National Trust properties or going out to farms, but I was very aware of trying not to make them about us, but about, again, allowing the viewer this tactile, visceral kind of stepping back in time. The other thing we did, completely misguided idea of kind of getting back to reality, but I should pick up my own dropping out bit at this point. So I did, I sold my house and I split up with the partner I'd originally moved to the north of England with, and sort of down the line I went part-time, so I had more time to do my own work, and then eventually met my current husband, who's partner, and we now have 2 children, and a very neglected allotment. And my daughter, after much thought and a little bit of soul searching, I actually called her Eden, which I have to say just totally suits her. And this is our allotment, which is about as far from utopia as you can get. If you want to get back to nature, don't get an allotment. It's just basically mud and work and guilt. But no, that's just like, it's actually lovely. And it's nice to just get outside and try and grow things, even if you fail miserably. So just a little bit about Kirkdale and the philosophy of education. Kirkdale's the free school that I went to. Interestingly, having a child of my own, I was thinking a lot about kind of, you know, the choices I might make for her, and thinking about, I spent many years not entirely sure that the free school my parents sent me to was a good idea. It was based on the principles of A.S. Neil Summerhill. It was called Kirkdale. And Kirkdale was set up in 1976 by John and Susie Powsland and a group of free-thinking kind of parents. Sorry, it was set up in 1964, but I attended it from 76 to 87. I should correct that. And they actually put an ad in the paper asking for like-minded parents to set up a school. But it was, there were other free schools, and there still are other free schools, not perhaps the Tory kind that we might be thinking of, but the sort of alternative education kind. But it was actually in a rural, urban environment, which was quite unusual. Most free schools were in kind of rural Idle. So Dave Walkling had actually, conveniently, photographed Kirkdale as well. And I included, and my mother's written quite a bit about Kirkdale, and that's also included in her essay. So I guess for me it was all about sort of finding ways of inserting this information without overwhelming the viewer, without kind of, without it being too much, but trying to just sort of distill it in different ways. But Kirkdale basically, well, Neil writes about Summerhill, which is, as I said, Kirkdale has the same principles. He says, "We set out to make a school in which we should allow children freedom to be themselves. In order to do this, we had to renounce all discipline, all direction, all suggestion, all moral training, and all religious instruction." That about covers it. It really was a free sense in the school in the truest sense of the word. And one of the things about this project, I suppose, is that it's kind of allowed me, I'll just come back to that one in a minute, it's kind of allowed me to, I suppose, revisit my past, to kind of reconcile certain elements of that, to be less, becoming a parent myself, I've become so much less judgmental of my own parents. I mean, for years I used to give them such a hard time, and now I think to myself, bloody hell, it's really hard. They actually do a pretty good job, you know, like, I had no idea, you know. And so that's been really interesting. And I wrote this piece, I won't read it now because I'm getting to the end of my time, but there's a piece I wrote about Kirkdale. Certain images, again, that for me reflect, I suppose, that's the piece Kirkdale best, reflect things I remember about Kirkdale, like climbing in the trees. There's actually a child with, these on my iPhone, they don't look very good actually, do they? There's a child with 2 children there, but I called that two-headed child because you can just see one head, but that reminded me of, and this image as well, a sort of serendipitous moment where my daughter was just reaching her hand into the rainbow caused by prism, which I couldn't have foreseen. And again, with images like this, you know, I struggled with this one for a long time. Is it too obvious? Is it too... But somehow they're there and they sort of become part of the work, and Malcolm really liked this one and used it for the exhibition cover at street level. And I don't know, I think you have a funny relationship with your own images. I have images that I've taken that I don't actually like, but somehow they need to be in there, if that makes sense, and images that I love that I've had to edit out. So you have to try to be your own sort of harshest critic and, yeah, and preferably ask other people to help you edit your work. So just coming to the sort of last section, as it were. I called this bit Growing Up in the New Age, Spiritual Emergency. I guess this is a little bit about what happens after the dropping out. I'm not sure I can ever really, in the sort of scope of this talk, tell you the full story, but hopefully you've got a little bit of a sense of the history and the kind of the past and sort of the meeting of my mum and dad, and then the kind of against the sort of the broader context a little bit. But for me, that kind of then translated into the kind of 1980s and a lot of late 1970s, 1980s, and a lot of the New Age activities that my parents were involved in. And for the exhibition, as I said, I raided my mother's bookshelf, and I came across this book, Spiritual Emergency, and I just thought that was the most fantastic title for a book. I think it's quite interesting for me because the whole sort of New Age aspect to the work, you know, I think the New Age gets very kind of negative press a lot of the time. But people don't really generally tend to kind of associate it with, they associate it with particular cliches, like we all do with many things. You know, psychics and all the rest of it. But I think there's another side to it. I just have to say, my mother has made me swear that whenever I show this photo, I will point out that she's actually the one with her t-shirt on in the blue, not the naked, bare-breasted one. There you go, Mum. These are just some more objects from the exhibition. Just go back to this one, actually. Yeah, so, running out of time. How long have I got here? Okay. So I just wanted to sort of position two different views about the New Age before I kind of move on to the last bit. Around the time that I was doing this book, I was asked by Ricardo Vidal, who was working at IGRS, which is the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? To write an essay about my work for a collection that she's doing called, to get this right, Alternative Worlds, Constructing Utopias on Earth and Beyond. Sounds interesting, doesn't it? I found it quite difficult, but it was actually very, very good to have to put all of this into some sort of written form. And one of the other writers was doing a lot of work about Houellebecq, Michel Houellebecq, I don't know if I'm saying that right, if there's any French speakers here. So I started reading quite a bit of his work, and that was really interesting because it's all about the New Age, and it's quite bleak, but very, very, very interesting. And so there's these kind of two views, really. One extract I want to read you from his book, Atomised, and then a sort of slightly more positive view of the New Age from an excellent book that I came across by Neville Drury called Searching for the Spiritual Self. So Houellebecq writes in Atomised about a particular character called Christine. He says, talk to them for 5 minutes and you'll see they don't really believe any of this bullshit about chakras and crystal healing and light vibrations. They force themselves to believe it, and sometimes they do for an hour or two. They feel the presence of the angel or the flower blossoming within, but then the workshop's over, and they're still ugly, still aging, still alone. They do a lot of crying here, especially after the Zen workshops. They don't have much choice, really. Most of them have money problems, too. A lot of them have been in therapy, and they're completely broke. Mantras and tarot may be stupid, but they're a lot cheaper than therapy. And I can kind of recognise elements of that, you know, like one week it's this guru, the next week it's another guru. But I think that's also quite a negative view. I think what it misses is that a lot of the New Age is about the individual search for kind of personal development and transformation, and kind of the human potential movement, I guess, is all about that. You know? So Neville Drury writes in a slightly more positive version of it. The New Age movement may well reflect the future of Western religion. Its fusion of spiritual practices is grounded not only in experiences of high consciousness and personal growth, but also in the perennial wisdom traditions of East and West. In a welcome contrast to fundamentalist extremism, the movement argues for a spirituality without borders or confining dogmas, for a tolerance of religious belief that does not exclude doctrinal difference. It's also searching for a paradigm that builds on new scientific insights while recognising that the foundations of life remain a mystery. And I think, you know, my thinking about it's probably closer to that, and certainly the way that my parents have kind of. So I'm a little bit more kind of forgiving about it now. I sort of think I can see the positives as well. The other thing that's been quite difficult to include in the book, but something that's been quite important, is thinking about sort of periods of, I suppose, spiritual and emotional exploration that maybe go too far the other way. This is called Earth Changes. Pass the text. My father used to tell me when I was a child that there were all these earth changes would come about, and that all the cities would be washed away before our eyes. I used to think he was completely crackers, but actually seems to be coming true, doesn't it? So perhaps he wasn't so. But my dad, just including some of the images as we go along my talk, but my dad kind of did that thing of going perhaps to the other side, shall we say. Just coming to the end now, sort of about 5 more minutes, if that's okay. The image on the cover is actually quite an important image, because this was a moment where we went to see a guru called Krishnamurti talk. It represents for me in the moment. It's actually just an image of a wheat field in Northumberland. But, and my dad got this forked stick, and he started making all these, like, kind of, I don't know how to call them, prophetic sort of noises about, I think he sort of maybe thought he was like the new incarnation of Jesus or something. And he went off into this wheat field anyway, and a few people said to me, I think your dad's maybe had a bit too much Krishnamurti today. So I went after him with this book of Winnie the Pooh, and I said, Dad, can you read me a story? And then it was like, he snapped, and he sort of came back, and he was like crying, and then there was just this, and then he read me this chapter of Winnie the Pooh. And it was that thing of like, you know, it's been, I guess a lot of my work is about those dualities of love and loathing towards the family, of, you know, of the different, of the good and the bad. It's not one thing or the other. You know, there were really positive things about my upbringing, and there were not so positive things about it. And certainly having parents who are completely out of it's not necessarily what you want. But in a way, for me, this was an image of, you know, that point of spiritual exploration or a journey that, you know, is maybe something we all need, but perhaps you also need some reference to normality as well. But after that, my dad did, just quickly skip past this because we're running out of time, but my dad did have a proper psychotic breakdown, and he was actually sectioned after he created this series of divination cards, which are a bit like tarot cards. He's absolutely fine now, but he still does his cards, but at the time it was quite difficult. So this was one of the first texts I wrote, but it became quite an important piece, actually. It was as if the bottom fell out of your world that day. You saw him drenched in sweat, dishevelled, eyes rolling skyward, lying on the bare mattress, and you realised he no longer had the answers to your questions. That's my water again. That was how it was shown in the exhibition. And it's been interesting having conversations with him about how he felt about this piece. And that image I took was one of the only constructed images. Was actually, I remember going to see him in the psychiatric ward, and he was lying on this mattress on the floor, another mattress on the floor. And I remember thinking, oh God, this is awful, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. And then thinking, oh look, well at least he's got a drink, you know, they must be looking after him. And, you know, I had some counselling later on to help me kind of cope with this whole experience, and I saw this fantastic counsellor, and he said to me, people have this perception of sort of, you know, containment in mental institutions as like the worst thing that can ever happen to anyone. But actually, he said he'd done a lot of work with people with mental illness, and sometimes when people's own boundaries become sort of dispersed, if you want, they can't contain themselves, and they need something to physically contain them. And he sort of explained that it wasn't, sometimes it was what people needed, and that sort of helped me realise actually, and actually they did look after him very well, and he did get better, so it just goes to show. But so that's what that image was about. But again, I never use the text to tell people that it's directly about my dad. It's just there for you to kind of, to take it, you know, as an experience that's mine, but it could be yours, it could be anyone's. So I never use the word I just try to kind of use the word you, and not make it specific. Just go through a few of these. I'm aware that I'm at the end of my time, so I'm just going to go to the last bit here, and just say one last bit. So for me, the journey's been, you know, incredible, really, very kind of rich in terms of my own development as a person, my development as an artist, my experience of becoming a mother. I had my son just before the book came out. I published the book with Daylight, Taj Faror and Michael Ipkoff, who I met at Paris Photo, and I got funding from the Arts Council. It took me 3 months to write the application, but I was very fortunate to get some funding for that. So we did a touring exhibition which went to Street Level Photoworks and Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and then we did the book afterwards, because I said to them, there's no way I can do it all at once. I'll have a nervous breakdown, which actually I think for me was the right thing to do. But I've always worked with grids. I love the idea of kind of contrapuntal narratives that you can kind of work your way through, and I've tried to reflect that. So that's the street level show there. That's the Wolverhampton Art Gallery show. And some of the kind of ideas, I suppose, from that I've translated into the book form, although never exactly, because they need their own language and their own. Just a little final note here. If you're ever struggling to find a publisher or decide who to go with, you could try doing what I did, which is reading the crazy signs that your new age parents have told you to look out for. Now, in all seriousness, I had this really weird thing happen where once I started this project, this is where you're going to get to see the mushroom image finally before I stop talking. I kept seeing these mushrooms everywhere, and I was thinking about mushrooms and Alice in Wonderland and psychedelia, and I thought it was just too obvious, these bloody mushrooms. But I was photographing them anyway, so then I started to find them, I started to collect them. So I thought, oh gosh, I kept buying these mushrooms, and I thought, I never use them, they don't make sense, but in the end I did end up using them. And I had this big crisis, because Daylight hadn't published many books before, they'd only done about 3, I have to say they're fantastic. I could not have done the book. I mean, Dean Pavitt and Taj did my book the last 2 weeks when I was off having my baby. They just did all the proofing, they were amazing. The day that I was trying to make the decision, and Taj was kind of slightly nudging me at that point, and Val was saying, oh, you should go and see PhotoWorks, who are these Daylight, we've never heard of them. And he sent me his book in the post, and there was an image of a mushroom in there, and I was like, I know, Taj has to do it. I was like, don't be ridiculous, you can't make the decision about your book based on a mushroom. But anyway, there you go. So somehow the mushrooms ended up in the exhibition. Malcolm said to me, because I said to him, you know, as a curator, Malcolm, what do you think about these mushrooms? And he went, oh, you know, they feel all right, they feel right, put them in. That was the extent of his analysis. And what was great about them was they just really kind of drew people in, and kids especially just loved them, and I just thought, I don't know, make of it what you will, but there they are. And then one day I turned up at the Baltic with my daughter, and there were all these mushrooms, and I was like, oh, this is a weird art installation, whose does this work? And someone said, no, they're just here for the bank holiday for the kids. I was like, fantastic. So then I got another mushroom picture. And, you know, I guess in the end what I'm trying to say about these is they are obvious, but for me sometimes you do need a kind of an obvious cultural referent in an image, and that can also be a good thing, and sometimes you have to be brave enough to say, well, maybe it is a cliche, but that's okay too. And there it is. And I've got a couple of copies here if anyone would like to actually just come and give it a stroke and feel it. It's such a different proposition when you actually look at it as a book. It's much better than a PowerPoint. There you go, that's it. Thank you very much.